binary notions. I embarked on this thesis journey for several reasons. The first is to combine the ideas and scholarship from my previous theses in conversation with practices research. Similarly, I aimed to dive deeper into what gender performance means to me as a non-binary person. As theater spaces are where enacted performances of gender are constantly viewed and commented on, I was interested in discovering modes of gender performance that do not hinge on caricatures or stereotypes, though not excluding these types of performance. With that, this work aimed to add my voice to the ongoing conversation of gender diversity in contemporary theater spaces to center my identity in a world that wishes I didn't exist. This thesis touched on each of Streetlight Shakespeare Ensemble's 4 main show genres and excerpts from the Lamplighter stage reading series discussing my process of enacting gender in performance. For the purposes of this presentation, I will only be discussing my findings on the King Lear process. Before diving into it further, I must define some terms that I use frequently throughout this presentation to frame my work. The first term that also appears in the title is the box. This box is less theoretical than figurative, serving as a framing device born from the King Lear process that refers to the world in which the play is built. Imagining the world of the play as a box we were building helps contain the story we were trying to tell. The box, in conversation with the aesthetic of the play, helps turn the more extensive play into a palatable version performed by 5 actors. In building the box, our conversation was centered on several questions. What already lives in the box? What lives outside of the box? What begins in the box that moves out of the box? How do things outside of the box affect the world inside of the box? Regarding its use in my thesis title, the box also points to the body enacting performance. Outside the box refers to the deviation from the binary norms of gender and gender performance. In contrast, inside the box refers to the body on which gender performance is read and the heteronormative rules of the world. The use of the terms in tandem with one another, both as the world we play in and the body playing in it, reflects the idea of adhering to while actively challenging the world's rules. Another term that needs to be defined is flow. This exercise is an extension of Anne Bogart's practice of viewpoints that encourages actors to focus less on their character's psychology and more on observation and movement. Though improvised in the moment, these observations and movements have a specific exploratory frame. The physical viewpoints are the ones that were used most in rehearsal when it came up, and the flow is the repetition of specific gestures and an extended space open to create and play. Though the flows used throughout the King Lear process specifically had more parameters in terms of character building and relationship, the flow exercises helped uncover the box's properties and how it affects its characters. The last term is first-person authority. Talia May Betcher coined this term, which expresses the idea that trans people have the authority to share their personal experiences on how their identity and gender are specific to them, as, quote, gender and sex are woven into forms of life that reflect and regulate interactions, end quote. The theater has always been a literal stage for these reflections of queerness and forces the audience to interact with them. Betcher explains that we as trans people have this authority because, quote, there is no basis for explaining the existence of first-person expertise or even the presumption thereof on a prior basis, end quote. For the King Lear process, I became interested in how character physicality and emotion could reside within the same body. I was eager to learn what makes these characters tick and how to differentiate them enough in performance. However, for this process to work, I needed to get a better understanding of who these characters were to make choices regarding gender in performance. Specifically, how these performances fit into the box. I found that flow helped advance the transition between characters, not just within the scope of gender performance, and aided in the process of understanding who each character is. For starters, it is important to establish the world of the box we built. This version of Shakespeare's King Lear was set in 1930s Appalachia, which established a specific time and place for the box and created a lens through which to build character. This aesthetic was literally close to home for me, and this immediate attachment meant that my characters could live and breathe like real people, inspired by members of my own family. I got to bring a piece of myself and my background, which was the first in any show process I've ever been a part of. One of our first flows was the most essential part of my process, and our early work with company manager Doreen Beckdahl helped me create specific movement scores for both characters. This allowed me to practice the ways both Gloucester and Goneril expressed fear, love, and anger, and the ease with which I flowed into each. While in flow, I paid attention to my tempo, how I traveled, and how that communicated character. I determined that Goneril is in the directing path, but focused in tempo and intensity when trying to get from place to place. Similarly, she holds herself to an incredibly high standard as both the firstborn of Lear's daughters and potentially having to step into the role of mother in the box we built. When she was in a state of anger, she often refused eye contact. She feels an underlying pressure to compete with Regan in front of Lear and others, however, she still confides in her. I also noted how Goneril thinks she's more open than she is, at least in her relationship with Albany. She became much more tender in the box than most portrayals I've seen. She's often just written off as the evil older sister with not much else to go off of. SSE's device show, 81 Minutes, is where I first began to play with her more tender side. We were given a creative writing assignment, and I chose to write about her and Albany's honeymoon, and how that meant so much to her. Though, like her sisters, she was given away to him by Lear, Albany showed her kindness and affection. I wanted to carry some of that over into my flow work, which turned into beautiful moments where, as our prologue might suggest, Goneril expressed the love that she still had for Lear. This tenderness manifested itself in her interactions with the Fool, played by John Williams in both the devised show and the small-scale Lear, and how her frustrations were replaced with feelings of empathy. While playing with Gloucester, I also took note of my movements and how they informed my character. I concluded that he is a man who is very proud of what he has, regardless of where he sits on the hierarchical ladder of this world. But he is fatherly in spirit and functions as the front of house, so to speak, for Lear's kingdom. He sees a lot of himself in his sons, which contributes to his love he has, and his extreme reactions for the potential betrayal of his legitimate son. In Flow, specifically, I was interested in how his love for his sons manifested through play. True, he does react a little harshly towards Edgar for allegedly plotting to end his life. However, he loves both Edmund and Edgar about as much as he fears losing his status. Moments like these in Flow make Gloucester's track much more tragic for me as the one telling his story. Before touching the eye-gouging scene, directors Anna Bigham and C.C. Richardson put us through a few flows where we tracked through the scene's events. In the first flow, I ended up giving more of myself than I initially thought of and had a very strong emotional reaction to Edmund's betrayal and his setup of Edgar. Real tears were shed on many occasions in these flows, but they never affected my work or my mental health in the process. As the process developed, to nerd out a little bit, similarities began to emerge between the two characters with specific textual references that enhanced the double. After Gloucester gets his eyes plucked out and runs into the mad Lear with unbeknownst Edgar, Lear cries, quote, "Ha! Goneril with a white beard!" End quote. Though this exclamation emerges from a troubled mind, it makes the double more nuanced as both characters have similar positions of status and proximity to Lear. Secondly, they share similarities in their language. Both flip between verse and prose, although Gloucester more so than Goneril. However, in verse, they both tend to add 11 syllables, creating unstressed or uncertain endings to their iambic lines. Though this made memorization tricky at the start, character-wise, it meant that both characters frequently had more to say than could be nicely squeezed into their lines. Thirdly, they are characters that have similar allusions in their speech. Both refer to the celestial entities to further their arguments or viewpoints. Gloucester specifically tells Edmund, quote, "These lit eclipses in the sun and moon pertain to us." And Goneril tells Oswald, "By day and night he wrongs me." Granted, the Arden Three will tell you that Goneril's use just means all the time, whereas Gloucester's talks specifically about a time and date and calendar. But I still think there's a deeper connection between the two uses, even though there's no other allusion in the larger text. The similarities in language also might contribute to Lear's explanation, making Lear aware of the textual similarities. Arden editor R.A. Folks claims that this moment is to press the text very hard, and seems to be aligning Gloucester with Goneril and flattery. Whatever the case, both characters seem to share the need to maintain their status and power. When their status is threatened, they go to extreme lengths to keep it intact. I found appreciation and enjoyment in getting to be with these characters. As an actor, I believe that plays are personal histories, stories told by many individuals. With that in mind, the challenge of telling these two different stories was something I was both excited for and ready to embrace. Thankfully, because of the scaffolding our directors and stage management team provided, I walked into the Lear process less stressed than I was prepared for. From the beginning, there was an immediate attention to a care-filled process as the play's plot struck a personal chord within our company. Similarly, as mentioned earlier, I got to bring a bit of myself and my heritage to my role, a unique experience I will never forget. All these aspects of the box we built came together to create a space where everyone involved wanted to be there and wanted to do the work necessary to make the Shakespearean tragedy come to life. From this case study, multiple factors are involved in gender performance. For the small-scale genre specifically, you need a strong foundation of physicality for the characters to live in the actor's body, and mentality to help the character live in the box. With that, creating the box in a close-knit and intimate setting of a small scale meant that we were constantly reacting to and learning from each other as we built the world together. Grounding the world in a clear concept and location made character choices that are much more specific, reflecting a real community of real people and hardships. From all of my findings, my main argument is that perceived gender in the theater setting is understood by an audience through gestural work and embodied performance, rather than specifically male or female coded thinking. Something interesting about the process that Gloucester required more specific work in my character building. Not only did he end up using a regional dialect for the world we built, though a dialect I'm familiar with, but I also had to pitch my voice lower than my natural register, as I have a higher speaking voice than most people assigned to me at birth. Goneril, in contrast, sat perfectly in my natural register, other than some moments of frustration. Growing up, and even now, people who hear my voice and without seeing my face assume that I am female. With that, Goneril affirmed my comfort in my femininity, and I was able to use that to aid in my performance and find more variation between these characters. This year and this thesis have been significant to me, as I have never focused on my own transness inside of my work before. My previous theses discussed gender as performance in my BA and early modern gender subversion in my MLit. However, neither reflected me as an actor or an individual as much as this one has. The theoretical framework of the box, both in terms of the world of the play and the body of the actor, provided me with a driving interest and specificity in everything I was doing. Was I always successful in performing gender? That's for audiences who saw each play to decide. However, from developing movement scores through flow and the aesthetic of the box in King Lear, and what I discovered in the other show processes, I have the first person authority to claim that I was successful for the purposes of being true to myself and my identity. As mentioned in my introduction, flow is an excellent exercise to use in rehearsal spaces. It allows for actors to play and experiment with their characters in real time to discover elements of the world of the play, box, and the performance right onto the body of the actor, box. Furthermore, flow helps advance the transition between characters, not just within the scope of gender performance. It aids in the process of understanding who each character is for the actor playing them. True, as shown in my research, some of the gender performance comes from costume design choices. However, character development and gender performance also need to be grounded in the play. Some of the choices you are making come straight from the text you are working with, and some rely on the production aesthetic. Giving characters the freedom of authenticity in their environment produces a specific performance of gender. Additionally, it allows me as a non-binary actor to be authentically myself in each show process. I hope this stage in my story will make actors think consciously about their own gender performance, and that my experiences will be heard rather than noticed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. Yes. You guys talked quite a bit about Lear, so I want to ask you a little bit about Mark on there. You were an actor and a co-costume designer, so could you speak to how being a designer gets to kind of determine a bit of the perceived costume representation works for you and your exploration?
It was interesting being a designer just because designers are part of what builds the boxes, I would say. And working with Julia Summers, the other costume designer, we were really interested in kind of dissecting what the world was, both in the Muppet aesthetic and also the decade which Raphael landed on, which was like the 70s or 80s, kind of. And we were really inspired by, honestly, drag artists. There are a lot of pictures of early RuPaul days on our pictures board. Also, the fashion aesthetic of like Elton John and David Bowie, the other pop icons of the era, that all consistently played with their gender performance dignity and everything that they did, both like the performances on stage and the music or not. And so both of us were really interested in showing how queer the 70s and 80s were, and that manifested in some of the costume choices, like for Ursula, to quote Julia directly, we wanted to make her as booby as possible, as she started to become a little bit inspired by Dolly Parton. Other characters such as pimp vibe, but also he got some flamboyance in your portrayal. Also, we wanted to acknowledge design choices for female presenting actors playing male characters. We wanted to like still have comfort in their version of the characters. So I mentioned my thesis of Cece playing Windwife. We had to do a sort of like half up, half down situation with her hair, both to make her comfortable not having to put all of her hair up, but to still align with both her femininity and also the masculinity of the character she's playing. So yeah, it was kind of fun things to both play in as an actor, but also is like, how do I help create this world in the way that's like? That was long winded. I'm sorry.
Thinking, staying on other productions as well, because you wrote about all of them. As part of your process of self-evaluation, you chose to interview Andrea and Katie Shines. Yeah. As cisgender females doubling male and female roles in Much Ado, which I thought was a really fascinating collaborative movie. So what was your impulse to include other members of the ensemble in a study focused on personal projects?
Yeah, it was kind of a bit of me being like, I have nothing to worry about in Much Ado because I'm not acting it. But in a different way, it was kind of like my work as like the stage manager being kind of an observer in the box and kind of wanting to know like what was happening for other people. So I asked Katie and Anna who would be willing to answer a few questions for me that kind of dug into their own process of how they clarified both Hero and Ratio, and then how they clarified Margaret and Conrad and how they existed in their bodies, and how like the rapid nature of like the quick changes like helped or hurt their performance and like their creation of like what the gender of that character was. And I got a lot of really interesting information that I actually took into my year process. Like again, because they both mentioned something about like their physicality and their mentality, both as Hero and Ratio or Conrad and Margaret were like slightly different in order for them to kind of fall into the character, which I thought was really cool. Yeah.
My next question would be, in the documents where you're working with Q scripts, you mentioned that a lot of this portrayal is grounded in play, but if you don't have the play, how does that work for you with Q scripts when you're working with Parador in your exploration process?
Yeah, a lot of my exposure with Parador came a little later than me because once of course I was trying to memorize my lines as much as I was going into the first rehearsal, like all over. But once I saw kind of how the pieces of the world fit together, I was able to make clearer choices. Like, oh, okay, this is gratitude. Oh, I'm understanding the dramaturgy in the room was super duper helpful. And I have a question about this. They're like, I have an answer that might help you. And I was like, great, that actually does help me, perfect. And so a lot of my choices came inspired by both the aesthetic that we as a company kind of centered on, both Jim Henson's Labyrinth and Rude of Princess Bride is like a fantasy Renaissance style show, but also kind of understanding like, okay, Parador in this world was fighting in a war and is now exiled for some reason. So like, yeah, just once the pieces came together, it was easier to like figure out, okay, how does Parador fit in the world and what things can I do to like help portray that?
Well, with that excellent answer about portrayal, thank you very much for your hands together.
Making classical theater relevant to audiences is something that can be found on many
values, usually surrounded by language of Shakespeare's assumed universality, man for all times, etc. Creating art with the audience in mind is certainly a worthy goal. However, that is usually more easily said than done. What does it mean to actually make Shakespeare accessible to a modern audience? While I believe that Shakespeare's work transcends time and place, I do not think it is possible to create that kind of transcendence without the work of the artists involved. Nor do I think it is enough to just speak and naturally people will understand what it means so long as we're clear. Context is required, and it is the artist's job to create that context. Any production is an adaptation whether or not it is trying to. Aesthetically, our production set the year in a Great Depression 1930s Appalachian community. However, as the process continues, this became more than aesthetic and did more than inform our costumes and set. My thesis demonstrates how the understanding that the Southern Gothic period architecture grotesque shaped and informed my portrayal of the third and beginning Edgar. Using this literary background helped me shape the rules of the world for each of my characters. It helped provide boundaries and restrictions, which in turn created higher stakes when those restrictions and boundaries were violated. I will begin by providing background on the grotesque, especially as understood by the Southern author Flannery O'Connor. My thesis connects this idea of the grotesque to the characters of Edgar and Megan, and finally highlights how the grotesque can be used in the costume design of the show. Our good friend, the Oxford English Dictionary, provides 9 definitions for the word grotesque as both a noun and an adjective. In literature and art, grotesque is quote, characterized by distortion or unnatural combinations, fantastically extravagant, bizarre, end quote. My background in literature in dealing with the grotesque came from research work I did as an undergraduate. When I think of the grotesque in literature, I think of 20th century novelist and short story author Flannery O'Connor. Alright, so who is Flannery O'Connor? She was an author who wrote about the grotesque at her native state of Georgia. I became familiar with her work during undergrad, and the world of her writing fascinated me. I think the reason it grabbed my attention was because I did not understand it. And it was frustrating. I could tell there were several layers to her writing, and she was saying something interesting in her fiction, but I struggled to understand what those things were. So, in response, I launched into an intensive study of her full body of work and study of her life. O'Connor only lived to the age of 39 due to her lifelong struggle with lupus, but she left behind a substantial body of work in both fiction and essays. Her stories are realistic in the sense that they happen in real places to people who O'Connor often based on those she knew in her community. O'Connor was born and raised in rural Georgia, a fact that her New York writer friends expected her to distance herself from. O'Connor observed that there was a tendency in many of her New Yorkers' peers to play into the myth that, quote, writing is a lonely occupation, involving much suffering because supposedly the writer exists in a state of sensitivity which cuts him off or raises him above the community around him. O'Connor pushed back against this idea of the isolated writer and engaged with the troubled, turbulent, and in her words, haunted region of the country she had grown up in. Her stories almost exclusively feature in the South with distinctive, larger-than-life characters. Her stories have been described as violent, dark, and grotesque, a description she herself thought was fitting. O'Connor's work includes much of what she and many others call the grotesque. Her stories are populated by escaped convicts who murder entire families on vacation, Bible salesmen who cheat girls with wooden legs, insufferable academic artists who waste away on the family farm. In these grotesque works, she writes, we find that the writer has made alive some experience which we are not accustomed to observe every day, or which the ordinary man may never experience in the ordinary life. There are larger-than-life qualities to both the characters and the stories. Circumstances and characters could feasibly exist, but we don't expect them to. Drama is similar. You don't want to see a play about the best day of someone's life. You'd like to see a play about the worst day, or at least the most interesting day of someone's life. Hamlet would not be about much that took place before he was murdered. Plays, or at least good plays, are about action. Things happen. Acting itself is an active word, and I wanted to use the small-scale process to train active engagement on stage. Shakespeare's works have plots that operate in heightened or unrealistic circumstances, much like O'Connor's fiction. However, because of O'Connor's more recent career and setting, her worst circumstances feel more realistic, or at least more familiar to an American audience. The extremity of violence in O'Connor's stories varies, but most of her stories contain a moment of violence that triggers the character's transformation. This transformation usually involves the main character seeing clearly or becoming aware of their flaws, though often it is too late for them to do anything about it. I make the distinction of grotesque violence because in order for a moment of violence to count as grotesque, it has to push the boundaries of the acceptable kind of violence that has been established to a certain point. In order for moments of the grotesque to properly land with an audience, it is important to create a world for the play as opposed to reality. There has to be a baseline so that the grotesque can diverge from the rules set up. In the short story, A Good Name's Hard to Find, the first moment of violence comes when a family of 6 gets into a car accident. stories about a road trip, a car accident isn't especially shocking or out of the realm of possibility. The brutal execution of said family at the hands of an escaped convict called the Misfit, however, definitely is shocking. So, to clarify, car accident is violent but not grotesque. Serial murder is violent and grotesque. What is happening here? I don't want this. Okay, good. There are plenty of grotesque moments present in here. Perhaps the best example is the blinding of the lost. It is one of the most shocking moments of the play, and it is certainly something we can conceive of happening in the world, but not something we expect to have happen in front of us, I hope. There is also the performance of Edgar as the Tom. We don't run into mad daggers every day, but encountering a mentally unwell vagrant isn't outside the realm of possibility. The final duel between Edgar and Edmund also falls into this category of grotesque. A duel itself isn't necessarily grotesque and tragedy, but the circumstances of a brother challenging a brother because of treason against their father is. There is violence in here, such as the beating of servants, warfare, the division of the kingdom. However, the eye gouging goes beyond the acceptable bounds of the world's violence. There is purposeful cruelty behind the action, and that is what pushes it beyond the rules of the world into something truly grotesque. So, stalking servant? Yes. Blinding Gloucester? No. I was able to use O'Connor's thoughts on the grotesque to make sense of the world of our play, as well as apply those principles to individual character tracks. I'm going to talk especially about Edgar. So, Edgar is a challenging character for a lot of reasons. He spends most of the play pretending to be someone else and playing madness, which creates an extra challenge for the genre on a small scale. Edgar's madness has been the subject of much scholarly discourse and led to a long history of actors trying to portray what that means. And that's when my background work with Flair and O'Connor offered the insight into specific characters as well as the world of O'Connor. In O'Connor's stories, she has characters whom she affectionately refers to as her fruits. These characters are usually divorced from the social framework of their world, either on purpose or by virtue of their circumstances. These characters often have a form of disability which serves the physical manifestation of their social otherness. O'Connor wrote to a friend that she identified among the ranks of her freaks, and she often found herself on the outside of social acceptability. She spent the majority of her adult life disabled and constantly scandalizing her respectable southern community with her shocking and incorrect and proper writing. Oh, the horrors of an unmarried, educated woman. The characters who are missing limbs, suffering from illness, or deemed crazy by the rest of society are usually the ones who speak truth to those who do not wish to hear it, in O'Connor's words. It was O'Connor's belief that characters in the grotesque must, quote, have an inner coherence, if not always a coherence to their social framework. Their fictional qualities lean away from the typical social patterns towards mystery and the unexpected. Edgar's behavior as poor Tom is unexpected, a kind of rogue element to the story because it's outside the bounds of what society considers acceptable. Edgar presents another challenging question. Why doesn't he reveal his identity to his father? He went back and forth, struggling to come up with a logical struggling to come up with a logical answer for why Edgar allows his father to attempt suicide and continues to put up a false persona even after he's brought his father back from the brink of despair. Is he afraid that his father still hates him? But Edgar hears his father say, quote, "Oh dear son Edgar, if I lived to see thee in my touch, I'd say I have eyes again." His father says that he could reconcile with his son, who would be comforted and his suffering would be relieved. Instead, Edgar continues to toy with his father, even making several comments about his blindness that can be interpreted as darkly funny missteps or intentional mockery. When Gloucester asks if he has fallen, Edgar replies, "The dread son that is chalk born to but look up," which is an exceptionally cruel thing to say to someone who obviously cannot look at anything. I could not land on a logical reason to explain Edgar's behavior. However, I again found a possible solution in O'Connor's essays. She writes about grotesque stories and characters that, quote, "The meaning of a story does not begin except at a death where adequate motivation and adequate psychology and their various determinations have been exhausted." That is, sometimes it is more important that a character does something rather than spending time trying to determine why they do it. More simply, O'Connor says the storyteller is concerned with what is. Trying to analyze, create, and manufacture motivations for a character on stage can quickly become internalized, stripping the action from the scene. At first, I spent a lot of energy during the clip scene trying to make it make sense. I wanted to come up with a reason why Edgar does what he does. I wanted a solution. After a few tries that were not working, I talked to Glenn McKinnon. She worked with me on the scene, and her advice was to stop trying to reason why Edgar did or said something, but rather accept what he says and try to use it to affect the change in my scene program. Trying this approach pushed the scene out of my head and out into the realm of action for me. I extended this approach to my other track, Regan. Regan is the weird sister that I struggle to understand the most. While the audience sees Gabrielle's frustration with her father in her house, we see less of Regan. She mostly tries to cajole or pacify her father, rather than challenging him like her sister. However, she then hard pivots into torture and blaming Gloucester, not only complicit, but a full participant in the extreme cruelty. Just a few scenes earlier, she appealed to Gloucester as her good old friend and asked his help in mediating the rift between her father and sister. How do you reconcile these two things as an actor, especially when you have limited time to build a character? Regan doesn't externalize or soliloquize her thought processes like some Shakespeare characters. I did notice that Regan's speech patterns, she rarely speaks first. Usually someone, often her husband or older sister, says something first and she restates or elaborates what has already been said. Once again, O'Connor's idea of the grotesque character moving away from her social framework toward mystery was useful. Regan is a character who begins the play by abiding by the rules of society as a beautiful daughter and wife, who crosses the line into the realm of the grotesque by so violently breaking the rules and planting Gloucester. In order to propel Regan's character into the realm of action, I had to stop getting so caught up in why she does something and focus on the actions she is doing. As Kelly's forever yelling at us to do, Regan makes a choice. O'Connor's ideas of the grotesque certainly influenced my personal performance in our production, but I also discovered it made its way into the design of the show as well. The costumes and signifiers in our production were mostly grounded in the specific time and place, and sisters wore scarves, and wore a hat, and had glasses. These signifiers were literal in the sense that they were ordinary objects functioning within their ordinary purposes. There were a few exceptions, such as Beard's card and represent the fool, but the one I think I'm most qualified to speak about is the quilts. I designed the quilt during May term a little bit on a whim. I had never attempted a quilting project before, and I decided to use old clothing and simplify materials. For our production, the quilt started as a map of the kingdom Beard used to divide among his daughters. It became Portsmouth's hovel, and it was finally used for its intended purpose as a blanket during the Beard reunion, and finally used as a burial show. It feels odd to call an inanimate object like a quilt grotesque, but in following O'Connor's definition of the grotesque, where ordinary circumstances are heightened with unexpected or atypical occurrences, the quilt is an ordinary object that is viewed with meaning outside typical association. Quilt, which is meant to be an object of comfort or warmth, was used on stage to signify a kingdom torn apart, later to bury Peter's child. An item traditionally passed down as an heirloom was instead damaged by the very people it was meant to cover. Throughout the play, the quilt was treated with disrespect, stepped on by Ken, thrown to the ground by Edgar. It seems fitting that after every performance, I would usually have to make repairs to it. And for the record, I was definitely the one who did it the most damage. I didn't go into the production design of Beard thinking about how to apply the principles of Gothic grotesque to costumes, but it seems I had a thing going, and it seeped into every aspect of my work on this production. No! Gosh! Okay. Art, as I see it, is the act of telling the truth, whether that be in acting, design, directing, or writing. O'Connor was adamant that an artist had a responsibility of telling the truth. She wrote, "The artist operates at the peculiar crossroads where time and place can determine somehow. His problem is to find that position." See, she suggests that art requires specificity, and I agree. Specific time, place, and people are what make big themes concrete and resonant. This is why I do not think relying on broad themes or general universality is enough to make good art. Themes of generational struggle, dysfunctional families, patriarchal structures, and hardships of old age certainly exist in King Lear, but I think that approaching the play from a specific time and place helps to make those things clearer. By using definitions, language, and character archetypes from learning by prose and fiction, I was able to find ways to connect with my characters internally, as well as creating an active space on stage, and even finding cohesive people in our productions design elements.
Thank you. I think our threshold is going to open up again for our peer reader to ask us a question. It should be Margaret. Can you hear us, Margaret?
Yes, I can.
Whoa.
Excellent job, Ashley.
Margaret.
My first question to you actually is, so you use O'Connor's works, of advance of time, revelation, and theme during the show within your thesis to discuss how you drew on character archetypes when developing your tracks for Lear. Is there another Southern Gothic work, whether written by O'Connor or even not, that you didn't have a chance to discuss within your thesis, but you feel influenced your choices in the rehearsal room?
I did not get a chance to talk about Faulkner. So William Faulkner is the other Southern author who is the king of dysfunctional families. And he But definitely Faulkner was on mine. I almost had, when Edgar walks in reading the book, I almost had it be Absalom by Faulkner. I couldn't find a copy of it at the time, so it was some book on alchemy that I had. But yes, that would be the other Southern author who I would definitely come on. Just because it's very similar. I think O'Connor appeals to me more because she is a little bit more honest and less egotistical with her. I do like Faulkner a lot, but here.
I found this a fascinating approach to move in to your discovery of these characters, as I said, very complex characters to play. And coming up with the kind of Southern Gothic, grotesque, sort of a subgenre within a genre kind of thing. The question for me was that, you're in somebody else's, you're in a directed show and with a company, so can such a literary conceit work independently, yet cooperatively within a production, or did you have to do some dramaturgical work to inform everybody else about what you do?
I don't really think I mentioned much of any of what I was working on in my thesis to the group so much. It kind of just sort of happened that I happened upon using that literary approach in acting because I was, especially in the early weeks of the program, really struggling to get a lock on who these characters were, and so I was rereading. I think it was Endure and Chill, which is one of the O'Connor stories that happened, and I think it's only not in my presentation. And it kind of clicked a light bulb for me of oh, this is Edgar. This could work. I could work with this. So I think a lot of that was very personal, but having the dramaturgy work that John did, who were sort of foregrounding it in Appalachian community, helped draw some of the aesthetic comparisons that then became something deeper.
Margaret.
Yes, awesome. So my last question for you, Ashley, is what's the biggest piece of advice you can give future MFA students approaching small-scale acting if they also come from literary backgrounds?
Honestly, I feel like maybe one of the biggest pieces of advice would be to, at least when you're in the rehearsal process, try to forget your literary background. The opposite of what I just said in my thesis. But one thing that I talk about a lot in my thesis, and not totally literally touch on the presentation, is how helpful flow was of creating physicality, to rely on the physicality to help tell the story. And I think that that's been one of the biggest things I've learned throughout all of the 3 years of the MFA is getting out of your head and relying on the action or relying on the physicality of the scene. So I think holding, if you're coming from a literary background, holding those two things in tandem with one another is really important because it's so easy to get inside your head about what you're doing on stage.
Okay, very quickly. So one thing you mentioned there is family's determination to hold on to a thick Georgian accent, however confusing and uncomfortable it makes a smart new York phrase. And I wonder how much this might be contributed to attitudes into the application of Appalachian accents.
So we're definitely, and I talk about this more in my thesis, I'm not going to say it in my presentation, but I do think there's a distinct difference between Appalachia and the deep south where O'Connor came from. There definitely are similarities, but there's also a lot of regional differences. And I was really glad that we got these accents though, and to incorporate his background with Dylan May, which was really great. It was a lot of fun. But yes, O'Connor's accent into the dialect is not something she ever tried to mask in her work. And what's really cool is that you can still find recordings of her reading her own stories in her, and it sounds wonderful in her accent. I think the way that she writes is actually very well suited to that cadence and style of her. She never wrote in dialect per se, but when you read it out loud with that cadence, it just makes sense. And one thing that was a really cool discovery I made was just that I memorized things well. I don't really know what that's about, but it's cool.
On that point, so memorization. Warren, thank you very much.
the picture of Leon on
That's not mine.
You're a mess.
There's a
Can one of us
when there isn't a read, we take a picture of it. Can we get a picture? Please put your hands together for Ogun's presentation.
So my thesis is arguing in support of the theory of implementation, Shakespeare, the performing arts, and the creative writers industry. William Shakespeare died or stopped writing in 1616. Yet, as Paul Menzel records in his recent book, William Shakespeare, A Brief Life, has never stopped being written about. Indeed, the statement is true. Biographers dig deep into the intricacies of his life. Scholars write and revisit their works, making sure they engage with and redeem his works. Some intrepid scholars like Stephen and Menzer himself even scrutinize artistic recreation of his face. This busy business of Shakespeare is not only the monopoly of academics. Everyday theater practitioners also conduct a series of texts on his plays, detecting yet shifting his thoughts about the plays. How filmmakers adapt his plays for the screen is also an active scholarship. These various engagements affirm Menzer's claim that Shakespeare has never been stopped written about. Amidst all these various engagements, one avenue still remains lively through the idea of theorizing the writing of two or more Shakespeare plays from where Shakespeare ended them by intertwining their plot. To explore this idea, it remains substantial that I pinpoint the shortcomings of certain conflations arising from Shakespeare's plays. My practice aims at orienting creative writers who for decades context displacement conflating and making a conflation. In this presentation, I will address 4 things. Identify some conflations, show why they exist, and flag their weaknesses. The discussion will move to the 4th item, how my project evolved, where I continue Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet and Othello, from where they left off, intertwining them in a clear title and Othello. Before I identify some conflations, I will define the term conflation in the context of Shakespeare's performance. I define a conflation as a work drawn from Shakespeare's plays that creates a new unified story by intertwining plots of 2 or more of them. Now, I shall identify some existing conflations. The existing conflations that I am aware of are Sir Edward Derring's early 1623 conflation of the 2 plays, Henry IV Part 1 and 2, into one play. Edward Hall and Roger Warren's 2002 play, The Rosary, which condenses the Henry VI trilogy into 2 parts, including a number of newly scripted textual additions. Another is the Royal Shakespeare's 1989 Plantagenet, conflating Shakespeare's first trilogy, the 3 parts of Henry VI and Richard III. Surprising to some, J.S. Winfield, Adam Long, and Daniel Singer's complete works of Shakespeare are great revised again, first published in 1987, might also be considered a conflation. Why do these conflations exist and what are their weaknesses? Are questions I will address now. To answer the questions, there is the need to scrutinize each conflation's what I call pre-unity pattern. The term is unfamiliar, I know, but it is practiced by professionals. I define it as the justifications I define it as the justifications a person gives to an author, whether dead or alive, as a means to either address or excuse the changes made to the author's work. Normally, in an edited play, the creativity pattern features as either introductory statements preceding the play or footnotes defining how the body of the play is altered. Introducing a creativity pattern in a play alerts readers to detect what is and is not the author's hand, keeping the author's work untainted. Now, I'll talk about the weaknesses of some of the conflations I identified. After cutting 3,000 lines from Shakespeare's Henry IV Part 1 and 2 to create a conflation, Derring failed to provide a justifiable statement for it. Concealing that statement, his creativity appears as if it is a deliberate opposition to Shakespeare's original. Metaphorically speaking, it appears as if Shakespeare sowed seeds representing the 2 Henry plays in the fertile minds of Elizabeth. Then he slept. looking here and there, the ambitious daring sneaked in to sow tares. Just consider how Shakespeare badly felt. 7 years after the completion of the seventh stage of man, on April 23rd, 1616, a man of a lesser weight rewrote his Shakespeare's precious thoughts about King Henry. The metaphor lies with Peter Wolf's insistence that the play was created for nothing better than an amateurish performance. After he observed the manuscript, I can think, but not conclude, that Derry's play challenged the textual integrity of its source plays, especially that of Henry IV Part 1, which Abraham Watt and Paul Weston consider Shakespeare's most popular history play, which following its 1597 Part 1, went through 5 more editions in part before its appearance in the first volume of 1623. In Warren's introduction to Rosebery, a play that completes Henry V trilogy, Paul remarks that the aim for creating this compilation was to reduce the 9 hours of playing time to 4. The adapters, however, end up shifting Shakespeare's focus on Anglo-French religious issues in the originals to English civil wars. Also they incorporate new material, as Paul recalls the opening speech, the dying words of Henry V from Paul's Chronicle, one of Shakespeare's sources. Given how the adapters alter Shakespeare's focus in the compilation, it seems that reducing the 9 hours playing time of the source plays is not their primary concern. Instead, their focus appears to showcase how Shakespeare's originals mold the course of the War of the Roses. The conclusion about this conflation is simple. Paul and Warren's conflation simplifies the trilogy but slips into undermining its source play's essence, much like how Darren play did with Henry V Part 1, 4 Part 1 and 2. Andrea Noble's introduction to the Plantagenets develops an even more serious issues about conflations. I earlier stated that the RAC created this from Shakespeare's first trilogy, Henry V, 6 Part 1, 2, 3, and Richard III. Noble notes that the conflation originated as a response to, and this is where it is important to listen well, the numerous incidents of historical inaccuracy Shakespeare wove throughout the tetralogy. I argue that Noble's justification for why the RAC needed to create this play is bizarre. The rationale lies in the fact that Shakespeare's works are not classified as history plays or are not repositories of history facts. Instead, they are a way of looking at how he creatively represented some issues present in his era, much like Warren and Horseplay. Given this, the creation of the Plantagenet put a focus on exploring a creative approach to Shakespeare's tetralogy rather than correcting it. Many conflations will be inspired by Shakespeare. Most of his will challenge his credibility. This concerns the intervention I propose, theorizing the writing of 2 or more Shakespeare's plays from one independently and by intertwining the plots. My intervention guides the adapter to create a conflation from theory, and I define the theory of the conflation as the provable binding statement that elucidates the rationale behind an adapter's decision to conflate Shakespeare's plays in a manner that the conflated play sets its source plays in a continuous dialogue through which Shakespeare's intentions of his plays, in addition to the realities of his society in which his plays fit in, are extended but maintained by the adapter. Theory is significant because it allows the adapter to research Shakespeare's era and create a conflation with the body of knowledge there. Only under this intervention will a conflation not contest its source plays but enter dialogue with them. I have tested the approach by creating a conflation titled Othello, as I said, from Shakespeare's Hamlet and Othello. Othello is a play named after its hero, a Moor who is coerced by his white ensign Iago into wrongfully killing his wife. Discovering the truth, Othello kills himself too. Hamlet is a play named after his hero who, following his father's ghost command to avenge his murder by Claudius, the father's brother, dies on natural death. Because of the play's cases of death, I selected them and continued and intertwined their stories to offer the dead characters like Hamlet, Ophelia, Lytis, Othello, Desdemona, and more, a continued life. Othello opens in Denmark under the reign of Hamlet's successor, Fortinbras. How I opened the play is critical, in that characters in Shakespeare's original, whether dead or alive, remain the same, although their roles are stretched further. The play also introduces new characters to heighten the mystical ideologies I envision in a magical world of Shakespeare's Denmark. It was not my personal choice to infuse magic into the play. The source plays suggest that path. You all are thinking, how? I know. Hamlet and Othello's declarations made before their deaths bring the path. In Hamlet, Hamlet's dying words, the rest is silence, unless his impending rest in death, while also maintaining the possibility of his return to Denmark, much like his father's was escaping purgatory to expose sin or restore Denmark's order. Hamlet's words would mean, I will return when things go wrong in Fortinbras' reign. In Othello also makes a comparable remark before choosing to die. And you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am nothing assumed. The statement can imply that if the living twist his death story, he shall surely return. Indeed, both statements represent a covenant shared between the dying and the living, one that cannot be broken. Violating it may lead to a ghost's return. In Othello, sin causes monsterly ghosts to invite themselves to Denmark, making it more a mystically chaotic world. The atmosphere is like ghosts appearing to sanction deaths in Hamlet and MFA. Shakespeare was good at this mystic and chaotic business, so I kept his tradition in Othello after learning from Elizabethan world picture by E.N.W. Tillier, The Great Chain of Being by Arthur O. Lovejoy, and Supernatural Environment from Shakespeare's England by Kristen Poole. I have introduced my play, but what I have not yet done is discuss how it intertwined plots. In the play, a character I introduced as the chief secretary to the Church of Denmark unveils the case in his speech to Fortinbras. The Duke of Venice, who upon hearing Hamlet's death, grieved bitterly, has come to your land to mourn with you the state skill. One of the surviving characters from the tragedy of Othello, the Duke's visit to Denmark, where Hamlet is set, symbolizes the merging of both plays. Note, Fortinbras is the same character from Hamlet. The Duke also is the exact character in Othello. Implied by his speech, in Othello, the Duke acknowledges the tragedy of Hamlet in Hamlet as shocking news that no nation could withstand when it spread widely. The secretary reveals that the Duke states, like his Othello, Hamlet's death is uncommon, so Denmark he must be. Undubitably, the way the play continues and ultimately merges the narrative of its source plays is a testament of joint dramatization. The impact of this creativity is in twofold. It shows two unrelated plays from Shakespeare, how two unrelated plays from Shakespeare can generate a theoretical conversation when they are in conflation. In addition, merging these plays highlights the use of drama to enforce unity among societies. The creativity behind my work is to suggest that the making of character from Shakespeare's plays is not stable, but continuous even after his death. Overall, my play with this theory is to inform that creative writers can engage in Shakespeare's plays in transformative ways, uplifting our works through his own and his own through ours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eddie. I will ask just the first question.
Okay, so since you incorporated the supernatural because you had to, can you speak to any challenges you found in including that element and how it left the writing perspective?
doesn't go against someone's beliefs or anything. And another is that the issue of supernatural is something very, it's something in Shakespeare already exhibited in his play. That I was finding a way to have the supernatural characters interact with the characters who are not supernatural in a way that is more visible. As not seen in Shakespeare. Like in Hamlet, you see the ghosts appear, sit and go. And in my death, you see the witches gather, and you see them behind the events of the play. But in my play, they are present, and you see them within the action of the play.
It's really interesting. I think I've got a John first panel, which is that you make a really strong case where you say, with Julia and the letters, and she asks for we not to verbal letters, and we sort of assume that this is an expression of her emotional distress as postmodern readers. You're like, well, maybe it's because she can control the wind. Right? And I thought it was a very interesting point. So why do you think that in our postmodern worldview, the supernatural is invariably read as metaphor or character? And what do we miss to lose in this kind of reading?
I think it's because it's something we tend to ignore. We see it like it's just a line, but from a theory perspective, also if you read Mendes' recognition, Shakespeare lived in a society where religion or ideas of belief were really established. So he tried to put them into writing. So in a case like we see Julia telling the wind, blow not any of the pieces of the letter away. That wasn't just a case statement, it was Shakespeare doing a transfer belief from his society.
Outside of the supernatural, is there an element you would like to explore more that we can explore?
Yeah. I also have right now, I'm a person who tries to find gas and do something crazy with that. In my next conversation that I will do with, I will introduce characters where, like, characters where the character moves from different location. In that conversation, my character will be moving from different routes of Shakespeare, from Othello, and just based on if I'm thinking of laugh, if it's a laugh play, then I may have to choose laugh because of what when people who read at the time check what is going on.
Yeah, on that point, thank you very much. Thank you.
chosen for me was The Actor in the Target by the one and only Dr. Donlan. Now, it might sound extreme, but receiving this book changed my life. Donlan's perspective and wisdom changed my understanding of what it meant to be alive on stage. The approach in this book, originally in Russian and first published in 2002, takes an actor outside of themselves and steers them away from the intense, internalized characterization of one's inner life. Instead of always asking the question, what are you doing, regarding a character, Donlan suggests the focus beyond what or who are you doing it to. This what or who in question is a target. A target can be a person, a prop, anything that outwardly influences how and why a character behaves the way they do. There is a theme in this book, seeing the world through the character's eyes, and that unlocks something special for a younger colleague. Even though this book has stayed with me for almost 10 years, I want to make it clear that I have not come close to mastering the methodology. Donlan himself wouldn't quite brand his work as a complete methodology anyhow, but even so. Loyalty to the approach is not the point of his book. His disclaimer in The Actor in the Target is very much like something I've heard endlessly over the years at SFP. Many different professors and practitioners will give you the tools and techniques, and you as an artist have to try and try and try again. Once you have tried, you can pick and choose what works best for you, tailoring your approach to yourself and your needs. So for the last 10 years, I've been trying all of his tricks and settling on what works for me, as I grow as both an artist and an actor. Who is Declan Donlan anyhow? If you've ever heard Pete or Matt talking about Cheap by Jowl, you have Donlan to name as one of their co-founders. He's an internationally celebrated director, having worked all over the world. Notable achievements of his include forming the Chekhov School in Moscow and being appointed as the associate director of the Royal National Theatre in London. He's written and translated plays, and as I previously mentioned, he's an author. So how does this all factor into my research portfolio for this presentation? Well, originally I was planning on delving further into his first book. It's such a cherished part of my personal acting training, and in some ways it would have felt fitting to end two separate academic institutions with the same text. I was given a gift, however, last summer as I was pondering how I would go about this process. It turns out that Donlan was releasing a new book, his first in over 20 years. And it would only take a few weeks to arrive to me. I felt like I had struck gold because a completely new opportunity had revealed itself. This new book, The Actor in the Space, was fresh, not only in the acting world as a whole, but for me. If I had paired Target with my work this year, though I will always find new ways to expand my approach, I'd be leaning on my version of Old Reliable. Suddenly, I had something fabulously exciting and confusing to dig into. And in this way, with brand new work to research and new roles and ways to explore, I was going to have the space and time to mess around and experiment. So, The Actor in the Space. It is an extension of Donlan's ideas from the first work. Instead of centering the approach around targets, this new work shifts this focus to the space. What is the space, you may ask? Donlan's short answer would be, quote, all life depends on context, ultimately on the space around it, unquote. This sentence is 8 pages into this book. In some ways, it seems to be the thesis of this work, that life itself exists because of the circumstances that make it up. Donlan continues this idea with, quote, everything that lives, including you and me, needs its context to bring it into life and keep it alive, unquote. The context in question is the space, because everything that an actor experiences within the world of a character is entrenched in what's around them, what came before the play takes place, and what makes them who they are. To be able to step into the world of our characters as actors, we have to allow ourselves to be open and reactive to the space, whether that is because it answers questions about the conditions of the production, or because the space is constantly changing and therefore the characters must change with it. The space, as Donlan sees it, is amorphous. There isn't an exact definition of what it is, at least not in a succinct sentence. It's constantly switching, and the actor needs to be on top of what to do when it changes. It is something that a character is always trying to fix. Donlan points out that, quote, no space is ever ideal, unquote. If any space was perfect, a character would have nothing to strive for, and an audience would immediately tune out. Donlan sets up explaining this by relating space to sandcastles. There's something within us that sets up these structures close to water. We build them up to watch them fall apart. Audiences can be like this too. Plays are far more compelling where there is conflict. Whether or not there is a resolution depends on the ending, but the journey must involve some issue to fix. The space can give that to an actor. Donlan divides his book into different chapters that define separate entities of the space, including chapters titled Crowded Space, Quarantine, Character, and Predicament. While not rules per se, these titles indicate different elements of what makes up Donlan's interpretation of the space. Like in his previous book, he explains these notions and practically applies them to the work through commentary featuring Alex and Arena, two actors rehearsing scenes from Shakespeare's Macbeth. Within this chapter, Donlan delves into the psychology behind each idea, asking questions about life and art to unlock different understandings about the world. He goes further by creating keys, which essentially boil down each chapter to a handful of simplified rules. They are, in a sense, the thesis of each chapter, something that encapsulates the essence of each overarching idea. As for my own research, I applied some of Donlan's work with the space to my own work in Streetlights Ensemble Season, Streetlight Shakespeare Ensemble Season. My parameters included a specific chapter per show, which allowed each case study to delve further into the particular aspects of the space and how they fit each different character within their respective shows. First, I looked at Threshold with Beatrice from Much Ado About Nothing. Next was connecting Flow with Cordelia and Oswald from Shakespeare's King Lear. Finally, I ended with Dread as it pertains to Humphrey and Up's Wasp. Fair. For the purpose of this presentation, I, like many others, will be speaking on my work with King Lear and Donlan's chapter, appropriately named Flow. Before I do, I want to give a little bit of background on what type of production Lear was and why that aligned with this chapter for me. King Lear was one of Streetlight's small-scale productions. Small-scale shows utilize a small number of actors, typically around 4 to 6, who then play all the characters within the show. Because there are fewer actors on stage, there are typically only costume or prop signifiers to differentiate characters. Accents and physicality are also integral to the audience's understanding of character. As I played 3 main characters in this track, my ability to react to the switch in space had to remain fluid. My case study on Beatrice focused on the idea of her crossing a threshold when she was presented with new information from the space around her. This wouldn't work for a small scale, however, or at least not in the way that I had previously described. In a small scale, multiple characters can be present on stage at the same time, so every piece of new information provided cannot create a change within one singular character. Instead, it is often jump-starting the change between characters. So I looked at Donlan's ideas behind flow. His first key in this chapter tells us to, quote, attend to the flow, unquote. Though he attempts to define flow, there isn't quite a grounded and singular definition for it, because it itself is amorphous in essence. It is, in a way, the relationship between the actors and how they move through space. It's a conversation without words, boundaries, or rules. It is something that cannot be prescribed necessarily, or it will not be authentic. The flow I worked with wasn't just with the actors on stage, but with the many versions of myself. Going into this production, I was aware that my directors had their own concept of flow, and through their version, which is heavily inspired by Anglo-British viewpoints, and though the version isn't the same as Donlan's, there are similarities present. I asked my directors to share some words on their own definitions of flow. C.C. Richardson provided, quote, the basic premise of a flow is that the actors move around the space in character and react to each other in the moment, training improvisation and physical storytelling that may be more symbolic or non-literal than the blocking that might be included in the play when presented to an audience, unquote. Anna Bigham continued with, quote, the work we did in flow created physical and relational pathways that remained clear throughout the rest of the process, unquote. In many ways, I see these two concepts of flow as intersecting ideas. They are about collaborating with others, relying on each other to create work that only exists because of the alchemy of the artist's as opposed to the first show process where I charted her arc and how changes would impact Beatrice's reactions to the events unfolding around her. I had to be a lot more open to this production and allow for my own discoveries to happen as a person's As Donlan states, quote, unfortunately, there is no formula on how to achieve flow. It is a delicate ecosystem that feeds and is fed by everyone, and it's up to all of us in the room to make sure that it is a space open to flow, unquote. The space our ensemble created together informed every choice I made, as I slid between characters and moments in the play. Donlan calls this the invisible work and describes it as, quote, the preparation we must do as a company that the audience never gets to see, unquote. What I looked for is how this invisible and collaborative work impacted my choices as an actor within the confines of this production and how they related to Donlan's overarching theory about space. Oswald was, in some ways, the character I had the most fun with. Flo brought this character to life. As one of the primary servant characters, Oswald is set apart from the main crowd. Getting him on his feet was important to try and see how he counterbalanced the place of other characters. Though he made his own choices, they were often based on the whims of the characters he served. In one particular Flo session, after that, when I turned back to see Ken laying on the ground, I instinctively chose to return to the scene and use the quilt to tuck him in. In our production, Oswald was a man who was clocked into his job. He lives to serve, even when he's not always getting it right, which carries out to everyone who is giving his job to do. So when it came to this interaction with Kent and Flo, even after the taunting and the frustration, I felt a moment of tenderness between the two men, just attempting to succeed at their respective jobs. This wouldn't have been possible without the space to improvise with each other. The relationship between Oswald and Kent isn't the most important part of this play, but it deserves the same attention that the Lear and Foster families receive. Taking the time to expand upon their connection was essential for my own understanding of the character. Reflecting on the work made in this particular process felt a lot more connected to the choices I made with others in the room versus what I found by myself. Lear was an intensely collaborative process, and though it was up to each individual actor to settle on how the time looked at the end of the day, virtually nothing I found at the end of the process would emerge without my fellow actors and the room our directors set up. This was not only down to the fact that we had trust in each other to make the work really strongly believed in and that clicked for the whole room, but because how Flo brought it out the choices in the moment instead of analyzing before and after that after rehearsal. Showing up to the space in this instance felt like I was truly meeting it with my cast, as opposed to by myself. In part, that's simply the nature of how a small-scale production has to work, because there are only 5 of us carrying out the entire story. But it also made the work that much more enjoyable, as it felt like the chance to work through a problem with friends instead of having to face it alone. That said, it can not only be about the collective, and though this is certainly one of the more collaborative pieces of theater I've worked on, there are also individual artists working on the tracks. Some decisions had to be made on my own. Donalyn notes the importance of self-sufficiency with quote, actors should not erase themselves and become entirely subsumed to some collective. Actors need flow with each other to create life, but they also need to retain their individual responsibility, unquote. I had to keep this notion in the back of my mind as I went through the process to make it clear. It was so easy to wrap myself up in the safety net of my collaborators, but I had to remain confident in what I was showing up with. That's just one small part of how Donalyn's work helped to guide along my journey through the MFA season. I can't say I have a full understanding of this space, but I believe that its nature of constant change means that it can't be entirely defined. What it has meant for my process as the year went on, well, it's made me much more aware as an actor, aware of change within a scene and how new information calls for interest across the thresholds, aware of how other actors around me and our collaboration can create a state of improvisational flow, aware of occasionally indulging in the push instead of the pull. It focused my energy and attention on everything being a problem that the character has to fix, because that makes the scene that much more dynamic and difficult. Did I succeed in this endeavor as the year went on? I think in part. There will always be room for improvement, and I believe that my comprehension of the space will take a long time to unravel and understand. The actor in the target is a holy grail to me, but by no means did I get it on my first attempt. I'm not even sure I understand it to its full extent now, and I've worked through that book for over different years of different plays and parts. As with that book, Donalyn's work isn't meant to be perfected. He merely provides tools to help actors through the work, and they certainly helped me this year. The distillation of each chapter to a few specific points of the keys has provided me with a roadmap, and those keys have been added to my own learning trips as an actor. Thank you.
This is a little bit of a multi-part, so take whatever you want to run with it, but it seems relevant to Donalyn and your conversation, especially about the quote section you're talking about, the trust and comfort in the space with the friends and the people you're working with constantly. And I was wondering what thoughts you might have on that, or from your experience working on that subject in this year, any thoughts or advice you might have on approaching working on flow or what he talks about in the future.
Yeah, I feel like I was really lucky all year, but particularly for the teacher, to work with 4 other actors who were getting a shot at it. And as many of the people in this room already shared about that process, wanted to carry each other, wanted to push our own boundaries, wanted to delve into what is uncomfortable, grotesque, or any of these things, but just like had a lot of love for the work every day. And directors and stage management team who supported that as well. They were bringing their own version of flow, which we just happened to dovetail exactly with Donalyn's
Some of Donovan's keys, I think there are 9, is that right? Are framed quite curiously, and I think a couple don't find the space always wins. It's great phrase. And also, don't search for what the character wants, look for what they crave. Right? These are very negative. So how do you read these negative terms which contradict the common axiom that characters and schools find positive choices?
Yeah, I don't know. I think in some ways, especially with, and obviously we talked about it in the presentation, but with numbers, I don't know that there is something that he truly wants on his own, or like that isn't set up in that world because anything that he is expressing is because of his job as his movie center, effectively, and so instead taking that key of throw away what they want or to find the pushback instead of the goal. The more I indulged in that, the more I found my character, and it gelled with what Raphael wanted from the character. So I don't know that works for every single character, but there are going to be those where you're finding more problems, and that gives you more to do as an actor in many ways, because it's nice to have certain things as resolutions, but I don't know that an actor or a character always getting what they want is interesting to an audience.
I was going to ask about, you brought up a little bit about the goblins and how it's an unusual example here with space. And we talks about it. I wanted to talk a little bit more about with how Donovan's approaching the idea of the space. What was your thought process about the strengths of the Donovan's process?
Yeah, so obviously I said I worked on much review here at Barcelona here, but I chose to keep the goblins out of my thesis for a few reasons. Number one, that was a week-long process, and I'm not holding myself to that, of like really doing the work that I was doing for the other shows during that week. But also I thought it was a little bit curious because he is very within and without the world, especially because the company is lucky enough to give me a lot of epilogue, but those are not those actual lines, and so he kind of took on a new form that wasn't based in the text, and then also, if you saw the show, I was blindfolded the whole time as the bullet when I was within the world of the show. So the interaction with the space felt different, and while I think that would be very interesting to analyze as like a side piece to this thesis, it didn't feel like it would be
Sometimes you have to realize it's actually headspace.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, on that point, I think it is time for us to say thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Can you